Okay, guys, let's get started with the lecture today. Today it's all about different levels and the micro-macro link, but we'll come back to that in a second. Before I start, let me make an announcement. Let me remind you that there is no lecture on Tuesday. And on Thursday, there will be a guest lecture. So there will be somebody else standing here. Travis Tatum, he's going to be here. I won't be here during that week. Okay, before we start, take out your phones. The drill. We have that. You have a question here according to the article that you had to read for today. Article by Bickel and others, paper published in Science in 1975. Was there either a bias against female applications, a bias in favor of female applications, or no bias? Well, that's a required reading. Let me emphasize these things are relevant for the exam at the end of the day. If you stay on the top of these things now, it's much easier for you. Well, to be honest, this question is a little weird because the whole article kind of starts off with that there actually seems to be a bias against females. Right? There seems to be a bias against females, but then if you read the article a little more, you might have realized, hang on a moment, there wasn't really a bias. Actually, it was the opposite. There was a small bias in favor for female applicants at the University of Berkeley. So the second one would be the correct answer here. It's not that there's no bias, there's a small significant bias in favor of females. But we'll talk about that later on during the lecture. So what I brought with me for today, this is like the topic, the content that we have. First of all, as I said, it's about different levels. It's about micro and macro. And I want to re-emphasize the distinction so that you are aware of what are these different levels. Yeah? Because often, that's the thing, we're not really good in kind of thinking in different levels. And when you look at how, for example, social phenomena are reported in the news, often journalists make the mistake of mixing up these levels. As a good sociologist, you should realize that's a mistake. So I'm going to talk about two mistakes. The first one about looking at things on the wrong level, about explaining things on the wrong level, or making conclusions about one level while actually all you have is evidence for another level. Yeah? And these mistakes are really easy to make, but as good sociologists, you shouldn't make these kind of mistakes. And then the second mistake that people make is that kind of they look at things in separation from each other, but they don't connect those parts with each other. So you don't really understand one level if you didn't really understand how you get from the one to the other. And in that context, at the end, we'll talk about what is known as James Coleman's boat, which is basically like a way of linking the macro with the micro level together. So that's the content for today. So let me get started with micro and macro. At the end of the day, as I said, it's about different levels. We can look at things at different kinds of abstractions or in differently aggregated. So for example, we can study, this is now much more general, we can study global trade flows, for example. This would be at the very macro level. This is like a very general thing. Or we could study nationhood, sociology of nations. People do that. But then we could also go a little further below. We could look at how people interact with each other. And actually, my research would probably be situated there. I look at social networks and how people relate with each other and so on. But then, we leave actually the domain of the social scientist at some point. You can think about, okay, how does actually an individual work? And how does the brain of an individual work? But even then, that would be the macro level for somebody else who looks at things at the cellular level, right? And then even for the cellular level, that would be the macro level for somebody else who looks at something at the molecular level. So these levels, they all build on each other. And in a way, with social sciences, we are sort of more at the top of that, rely on other disciplines to give us ideas about why individuals behave the way they are, and so on. But other researchers rely on yet others to kind of give them the micro foundations of what they do. But even within sociology, or when we look at social issues, we can look at things at different levels. You can look at things at the societal level. There's society. That's like a very broad term. That's like the nightmare question you get from your grandma. what is sociology? Or what is society? Yeah. You can ask me that question in a pub, but I need to have had a few beers. And then it becomes either brilliant or completely stupid. But the good thing is, either way, you don't remember. You can look at culture. You can look at social institutions. You see, this is now already a little more specific. Yeah? You can look at social inequality groups, roles, interaction stuff. So you see kind of how these different levels sort of operate, or how kind of, there are different levels of where the focus is. And for a long time, sociologists also structured sociology departments like that. There used to be something like macro-sociology, and there used to be something called micro-sociology. There used to be like introduction to macro-sociology taught by somebody, and introduction to micro-sociology taught by somebody else, right? So whole departments were structured by that. With macro-sociology, people were concerned about social structures, institutions, civilization, culture, these big things, find patterns in these large collectives, and had big theories like functionalism, conflict theory, and so on. But on the other side, you had micro-sociologists who were more interested in small things, families, groups, face-to-face interactions, and so on. And like just a representative theory for that would have been symbolic interactionism. But hopefully you get from this lecture today is that this distinction between macro and micro in that regard is actually not very helpful. Yeah? Or that actually we cannot look at these things in separation from each other. Right? In order to understand what's happening at the macro level, you need to understand the individuals that make up that society, that behave within that context. And in order to understand individuals, you need to understand the context that kind of sets the constraints and opportunities for individuals to act in that society. So that sort of links these two things together, and that is then what is known as the micro-macro link. Just as a reminder, we talked about macro-level patterns already before, that ultimately this is what we want to explain. Segregation, your network structures, norms, and so on. But we need to think about the individual actors that form these populations and which sort of are embedded in these macro-level structures. So basically, the short message is one doesn't work without the other, right? Might sound trivial, but believe me, there have been decades of sociological debate and research around that, so people didn't think like that. And even nowadays, some people still think that we actually can just explain things at the macro-sociological level. I think that's mumbo-jumbo. Yeah. I think it's there are individuals in society, and it would be kind of weird to kind of ignore individuals just for the sake of justifying sociology by itself. I think the real power lies in kind of connecting these things with each other. Okay. So let me now talk about two mistakes that you can easily make when you look at these different levels, or two mistakes that you might not have been aware of. Well, the first one, I'm going to talk about this in much more detail in a second, is that you confuse these levels and you look for an answer on the wrong level. By that I mean that you might observe something at the societal level, right? And from that, you deduce that it also works on the individual level like that. Classic example would be people, generally people with glasses are intelligent. I'm wearing my glasses today, so I'm intelligent. That's not true. How do you know that? I could be stupid. But there you make the logical mistake of taking something, taking an observation or information that you have at the macro level, a higher level, about a population, about a society, and you draw a conclusion from that on the individual level, on a specific individual who is me. That's called the ecological fallacy. We'll talk more about that in a second. The second mistake that you can easily make is that you start taking things apart, right? You look at things in detail, you dissect stuff, and that's a very important thing that we need to do in sociology. You need to understand what are the components, look at them in detail and so on. Who is involved, who are the actors in this, and so on. But just by looking at the things in separation, you don't know how things work together. Just by looking at all those parts, you don't know why the car goes the way it goes. So it's about how those things are arranged with each other. So that's sort of like the second mistake that you can make by thinking that by just looking at one level, you explained another level. But I will come back to both of these mistakes now in more detail. So let me talk about the first one, that you kind of look at stuff at the wrong level. Again, our second-year sociology students, they should know these kind of things. It's also like a great exam question in the first year. It's about the ecological fallacy. And the ecological fallacy states that based on group-level data, we cannot make specific statements about the individuals that form these groups. Yeah. And as I just mentioned, the classic example is something like this, that generally people with glasses seem to be intelligent. You find an individual who wears glasses, and then you say, okay, that's an intelligent person. That's a mistake. Or there's like an old, there's always like some Greek stories around that, like, I don't know, I can't remember who the players are, but, it's like where this problem was first discussed. So it's quite old, it's known in the literature for a long, long time, where somebody says, yeah, people from Athens are very intelligent, and then the person says, oh, your father must be intelligent because your father is from Athens. Yeah? But that's not just how it works, right? Basically, the story is, and you will see that now, I give two other examples. The problem here is that there are two levels that are being confused with each other, the macro level and the micro level. Now I give you two other examples where that comes out, and it's actually less straightforward as the example with the glasses. But nevertheless, it's exactly the same problem, that two levels were being confused. And this is now where the article comes into play that you guys had to read for today. That's the reason why you had to read that. It's an article about gender inequality for admissions at the university. Or more precisely, it was this article by Bickel and others. They looked at male and female applicants to the University of California in Berkeley. Nice place, by the way. A friend of mine who did his PhD there, I visited him once. I said, Johannes, how do you get anything done here? Because it's beautiful weather, really chilled, And then he said, Thomas, it's like that every day. And so they did get amazing things. Very great sociology department. It's one of the best in the world, I have to say, Berkeley. Anyway, so this article by Bickel and others in Science, these are sort of like the raw numbers at first they present in the article. They look at males and females applying for degrees to get admitted to the university. And they observe that 44% of the males get admitted, but only 35% of the females get admitted. Yeah. And when you look at these raw numbers, well, what would you say? You would say, hang on, males get admitted more to this university. So maybe there's something going on here. This is actually, this could make a headline in a newspaper. Easily you can read these kind of things in the newspapers. Berkeley discriminates women. Yeah? More males than females admitted to university programs. Right? And now you realize why it's actually important to get these levels right. Because if you don't get them right, you actually make wrong claims or statements, or you accuse universities of discrimination, while in fact, as it turns out in this case, there is no discrimination against females. Actually, it is the other way around. But how can that be? How can that be? Well, the solution to it is in the following. This is now the data split up for different departments. By departments, they mean, Department of Mathematics, Philosophy, Sociology, Classics, Engineering, and so on and so forth, right? Now they have different letters, A to F. And now you see the numbers for male applicants and the number for female applicants. And for each group, now you see the percentage of admitted for that subgroup, right? So you would read that in the case that, for Department A, you had 825 men applying, and 62 of those got admitted, right? While for the same department, you had 108 females applying, and 82% of those got admitted. And when we look at the overall picture now, what do we observe is something strange. Well, actually, now the relationship seems to turn around. Actually, when you look at it, in 4 out of those 6 departments, now the admission rate is higher for females than for males. It's only 2, and there's actually not that much of a difference where actually males get admitted more, right? So actually now it seems that the relationship reversed, that there is a discrimination against men. How can that be? That's exactly the same data, isn't it? Where we kind of had the overall admission rates for males and females, but now we just look at it separately for the different departments. Well, this is a bit of a paradox, and it seems that male applicants get admitted more often, but when looking at departments separately, it seems that female applicants get admitted more often. What's the story here? Well, actually, the story here is that those levels got mixed up. Right? The solution is relatively straightforward. Turns out that some departments have a lower acceptance rate than others. Right? Some are just stricter than others. They admit more people, others admit fewer people. And as it turns out, females tend to apply to these departments with lower acceptance rates. When we look at the numbers back in the days, it used to be the English department, 65% of the applicants were female and only 35% male, while for the mechanical engineering department, it's pretty sad numbers, but this is like the 1970s. Hopefully nowadays it's different. There's no reason why there should be gender inequality here. But in those days, only 2% of the applicants for the mechanical engineering department were female, and most of them were male. And as it turns out, back in the days, the English department had a much lower acceptance rate than the mechanical engineering department, right? So although kind of females, or actually what the story here is, that more females applied to those departments where the acceptance rate was lower to begin with, right? And that kind of generates this pattern where if you don't look at the department separately, you might falsely conclude on that higher level, with that raw data grouped, aggregated at the higher level, you might falsely conclude that there is a discrimination against females. Well, in fact, actually there isn't a discrimination against females. If you kind of account for that, it's like a small favoritism towards females. It's actually very small, but nevertheless it's significant. But keep in mind that was like back in the days, it was like 1970s, numbers changed. But nevertheless, it's a great example, and that's why I included it in the readings for you guys, for a confusion between what we call an ecological correlation or something at a higher level, at the macro level, and an individual micro correlation. Just because something correlates on a group level does not mean that it correlates on an individual level as well. And there you can see how easily you can make this mistake. How newspapers just put their headline out, discrimination at Berkeley against females. It's a great headline, probably they like it, but actually in this case it is not true. So as a sociologist, you always need to immediately think about, do they actually look at the right level here? So the higher level would be female applications and acceptance rates, but actually the other one below is the application of a single female in the acceptance of this female. And you see how these are different levels, right? And how kind of you cannot just deduce from the higher level to the lower level. Okay, so that's example number one. I have a second example for the same story. It's like the same idea of an ecological fallacy. In this case, it is about illiteracy. Illiteracy is basically the number of people that cannot read. Right? It's a study by Robinson. It's also quite an old study, published in the American Sociological Review, considered one of our best journals in sociology. So if you want to read really good stuff, read the American Sociological Review and read the American Journal of Sociology. These are the two journals where folks like me want to get things published if I want to get a job at an Ivy League university. Fortunately, I haven't yet, but I'm working on it. It's not that easy. However, what they did, they computed, or Robinson, what he did, he computed the literacy rate. It's basically just how many people cannot read out of the ones that live somewhere. Right? The number of people, the share of people that cannot read, that's the illiteracy rate. And the proportion of the population born outside the US for each state. So it's about migration. So they look at immigrants, and how many immigrants live somewhere, and the number of people that cannot read in that state. So they look at states, that's sort of like now the grouping level that they look this at. And what they do find is that these two figures were associated, so at the level now of the state, so basically what they do now, how many people in one state in the US cannot read, and how many immigrants live in that state. Now, these are now the two things that Robinson looked at. And he showed that these two figures were associated with a negative correlation. What does that mean? That means like when you have more immigrants in a state, the number of people who cannot read goes down. Yeah? More immigrants in a state, states with lots of immigrants, fewer people cannot read. Right? So it seems like the reading ability is higher in states where lots of immigrants live. Right? The story around that was, okay, people come from different backgrounds and so on. How does that affect, the education that we have and so on? So it's a bit of a counterintuitive finding it today. People would have thought that it's the other way around. However, once Robinson looked at that data in more detail, looked at individuals, right? When looking at individuals, the correlation between being a migrant and the ability to read or not to read flipped around. Now there was a positive correlation, meaning that when I am a migrant, I actually have a higher chance that I cannot read. So on the individual level, actually immigrants did worse when it comes to reading compared to the people that already lived in the States before. But now, again, you kind of see that the thing sort of flipped around. So not only can kind of effects kind of become smaller or bigger, but they can completely flip around. And this is where you really need to be aware of, because these things, again, are reported in the news, but people didn't do their homework. They looked at things at the wrong level. So we have the same phenomenon. We have like a paradox where a relationship between immigrants and illiteracy seems to flip around once we kind of not look at it at the state level anymore, but at the individual level. So how can that be? It seems that immigrants are more illiterate than Americans. However, at the same time, illiteracy is higher in states where fewer immigrants live. You see, these things seem to be at odds with each other. But actually, again, the solution to this is that these two things are operating at different levels. The one, that immigrants are more illiterate than Americans, that's at the individual level. While the second, that literacy is higher in states where fewer immigrants live, that's on a higher level. Yeah? So here the solution is similar as before, that immigrants tend to settle in states where the Americans are more literate. So actually there just happened to be more immigrants going to the East Coast where more people could read to begin with, compared to somewhere in the Midwest, where people couldn't read well, but there were also no immigrants going there. Right? So the reason why states with fewer immigrants are more illiterate was not because of the immigrants, but because of the Americans who already lived there. Putting it in that schema, it's like a nice example for the confusion between macro-level correlations and individual-level correlations. We have states with immigrants, and there seems to be the literacy rates in those states, right? And that's sort of like a positive relationship. Also in states where lots of immigrants live, more people can read. However, when we look at the lower level, and that's sort of like being an immigrant as a correlation with the reading skills of that. So the mistake is mixing these two levels with each other. And that's essentially what we call the ecological fallacy. So you really need to be aware of what are the levels that we actually talk about. And now you've seen two examples, if you take the glasses, a third one, where these things actually can really matter. And why it is important to be aware of the level that you are actually looking at. Okay, so that was the first mistake that you can make. You can confuse and look for an answer on the wrong level. Let me now move on to the second mistake that you can make, is that you think you understood something just by taking it apart. So when we look at the beginnings of sociology, there are folks like Marx, Durkheim, Weber. You all heard about them. If you haven't heard about them, they should. Actually, for years, I'm working on a joke that starts with Marx, Durkheim, and Weber come to the pub, right? I'm still working at the end of it. There's a really bad one about suicide and Durkheim, if you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, I really have to work on that joke, because Durkheim doesn't show up to the pub. Yeah. So, but Durkheim, he said at the very beginnings of the discipline, Durkheim lived in 1910s, 20s. This is sort of when he was most active at the beginning of the discipline. Can't remember from which book it is. But one quote of his is, "The whole does not equal the sum of its parts. It is something different, whose properties differ from those displayed by the parts from which it is formed. And that's like I think that's a very important and crucial starting point for sociology. Before, I mentioned that last time at some point, utilitarianists, social philosophers, they thought, okay, the whole is just the aggregate of individuals. If everybody does what is best for them, we will get what is best for the society. But that is not the case, because the whole is not just the sum of its parts. And finally, I do some serious research about sports. I did my PhD about the English Premier League. I looked at interaction patterns of football players, and I did some fancy network analysis about who passes the ball to whom and things like that, to show exactly that everybody who ever played any team sports would agree upon, that the whole is not just the sum of its parts. It's about how those guys interact with each other. And actually, I could show that the interaction pattern in English Premier League teams really matters for how successful they are. Still waiting for the Roman Abramovich Fellowship up to date, but it hasn't happened yet. But nevertheless, it's an interesting finding that shows that the whole is not just the sum of the parts. I have another guy, Max Weber, you heard about, second guy in the joke. He comes along and he also says that social phenomena must be explained by showing how they result from individual actions. Again, you might think, aren't these kind of like trivial things? That's, social phenomena are explained by individual actions. But I tell you, well, actually, these things are not undisputed, right? So there's actually something here to it, that you have a social phenomena at a higher level, and he says it must be explained by showing how they result from individual action. So that's another level. So you have at least two levels that are involved here. And individual actions, which in turn must be explained through reference to the intentional states that motivate the individual actor. So it's again, those individuals are actually also embedded in society somehow. Another guy, founding father of analytical sociology, Robert K. Merton, he says sociology must deal with micro and macro level phenomena and develop concepts, methods, and so on for linking them. And now we are almost at a crucial component of analytical sociology, and that's what Peter Heisenberg called structural individualism. What does he mean by that? Well, he says we have social structures that constrain individuals' actions. Individuals are constrained by social structures. And often individuals are not aware of that. Most likely you are constrained, or certainly I have been constrained by the education of my parents, right? That brings me to university, and that brings other people not to university. So there are social structures that most often we are not aware of how they constrain our individual action and cultural environments and so on, and how they shape our desires and beliefs. There's the great idea of the habitus. Maybe you heard about that famous concept by Pierre Bourdieu. And the habitus is something somebody explained to me once as the unchosen principle in all my choices. So I make choices in my life every day. But there's actually a principle behind that in terms of like what I actually consider to be a valuable choice or what I consider to be useful and so on. So I still have my free will, so to speak, but the options from which I choose from are constrained. And that's sort of where society comes in a very sneaky way, because we don't really observe it and we are hardly aware of it unless you actually are a sociologist and you look at these kind of things. So it's about that, and we have individuals at the same time choosing the preferred course of action among the feasible alternatives and various intended and unintended outcomes of these actions. It's basically the idea that we have individuals that behave, but they are embedded in structures, and those structures constrain and give opportunities. Okay, and now we're talking about James Coleman's boat, which essentially brings these ideas together about different levels. And James Coleman, he suggests a way of how we should look at social phenomena. In his book, The Foundations of Social Theory, he outlines this little schema. And that schema, it's like if you take one schema out of this lecture, this whole module, this is the schema. Yeah? It's called James Coleman's boat. It's called boat because it looks a bit like a boat. Finally, in the German-speaking world, do we have any Germans here? In the German-speaking world, it's called Coleman's Badewanne, which is called bathtub because it looks a little like a bathtub as well. But anyway, the story here is we have macro-level phenomena and we have individual level phenomena. And in order to link macro level phenomena with each other, we should look at how the macro, the big one, constrains, sets opportunities for individuals to behave at the micro level, who then act in a certain way, which then aggregates somehow or transforms to the macro level again. So basically here the idea is that we cannot really make explanations on that level, but that we have individuals that we need to bring in. When you read James Coleman, he kind of outlines this idea by drawing on the Protestant Ethic from Max Weber. The Protestant Ethic, is like one of those milestone, contributions in sociology at the very beginning. Also helped to establish it as a discipline. Essentially, Max Weber, he kind of observed that capitalism emerged first in Protestant countries. Yeah? In the Netherlands, in England at the time. So this is sort of where capitalism came from. Or the US, you have the Puritans. This is sort of where capitalism was born. Capitalism was not born somewhere in Africa, somewhere in Asia, or elsewhere, but it came about first in Protestant countries. That's sort of an observation that Max Weber makes. And now Coleman puts this in this framework, in this boat that he has. And he observes this, now we have these two macro level phenomena. We have the Protestant religious doctrine, Protestant countries, and capitalism on the other side. And by now you should know, okay, these are macro level things. It's not like micro level. There are no individuals in there. But now, how does that actually affect things? And so Coleman outlines it is in Weber already, how the Protestant religious doctrine affects the kind of values that people have. There's this whole idea about predestination theory, that I've been pre-selected by God, and that I can actually show that and evidence that by living an ascetic life. So it's a certain set of values that comes with being Protestant, where they're sort of portrayed in Protestantism about how, don't ask the details, but it's about how Protestantism distinguishes itself from Catholicism. It's about how your role is in relation to God and what you can do to show that. As a Catholic, all you need to do, you need to repent. You can do basically whatever you want, as long as you say you're a sinner. While in Protestantism, you cannot do that. Yeah? It's more like every little action that you have kind of shows whether or not you've been selected by God. And this idea, this kind of values that then individuals get instilled by the Protestant ethic affects how individuals behave. They live an ascetic life. They save money. They don't waste money. Why? Because every wasted money would be wasted money and time that they could have used to honor God. That's sort of the whole idea. We don't need to believe in it. It's a long time ago. Yeah, but that's sort of a contribution of Weber. But you see how that kind of now fits in this schema that we have. And when now everybody behaves in an ascetic way, everybody is industrious, everybody saves money, everybody works really hard, as you should do for this course, do all the readings all the time. Yeah. Then we have capitalism emerging from individual economic behavior. Okay, in another reference, Peter Hessam kind of looks at this schema again, the Coleman's boat, and now he identifies different kinds of mechanisms. He says there are situational mechanisms. It's basically how individuals are situated within social context and how that works, how they perceive their environment, or actually how they might misperceive their environment. You need to distinguish that from just an institution or being embedded in something, and how individuals actually experience that. Then you have action formation mechanisms, how individuals then actually, once they have certain values or see something or experience something in a certain way, how then they behave. And then you have something called transformational mechanisms, is how do we get up to the macro phenomena again. And for these two links, I have examples that I want to talk today as well. So we do have these micro links, and now you can say, in sociology, we only look at this in a certain part. Conditions for individual actions would be the micro level starting point for us, and then individuals behave. But for somebody else, for a psychologist or for a neuropsychologist, that's the macro phenomena, and then they kind of go one level further and say, okay, that sort of conditions for cognitive actions, and then actually that is only the macro phenomena for somebody else who looks at the biochemical action and so on that is underlying that. Yeah? But as sociologists, we look at the part up there. So now for the remainder, let me give you examples about what we sometimes call bridge hypothesis, like how we get from the one level to the other, and why it actually is not that trivial. Yeah? Okay, let me first now look at the link from the macro level to the micro level. And as I said earlier, society or social context, they can constrain us. And when you come from a tiny little village like I did, you know how fucking constraining that can be. Yeah? You are there, everybody knows you, everybody knows your family, you just need to get the hell out of there. Yeah? So it can be constraining, but at the same time, social context can also provide opportunities in a way. Or the opportunity structure, that's an important term, coined by Merton as well, who says opportunity structure is differential access to opportunities among those variously located in the social structure. For example, you have parents who went to university. Yeah? It's like a different, or you have parents who are academics. You have access, you have different opportunities to get knowledge about how this whole thing works, right? While if you don't, suddenly you're here, there are dudes telling you things, all sorts of stories, and you are lost. You don't really know what to do. Where do you start, right? So you have opportunities presented to you through the social context as well, not just constraints. And one study that I want to use now to exemplify that is like a milestone study in sociology. It's a study called The American Soldier by Sam Stauffer. It's quite an old piece of work. It was published in 1949. It's quite old. But it was a milestone piece of work because for the first time they did like solid empirical research on a large scale. And what they actually did, they were embedded in the American troops in the Second World War in Europe. And they did interviews and handed out questionnaires and asked them all sorts of things on 500,000 American soldiers. Now, it's like the beginnings of empirical social science research, where we don't just have ideas, but where we also go out and kind of try to collect data. That's like an empirically applied piece of work to see if we can actually find support for our ideas. Because at the end of the day, our theories are nothing else than ideas. And, ideas, itself, they could be brilliant, but they could also be complete bullshit. Yeah? So it's just an idea. Yeah? Sometimes I call it a brain fart. Yeah? So you have them. Sometimes you don't know where they came from. Sometimes they're sweet. Sometimes they're just really bad. Yeah? But anyway, so that was like an idea where they went out and did this study. And what they found, so the American soldier is most known for its contribution to the idea of relative deprivation. And what do we mean by that? Well, it turns out that soldiers who had low opportunities for promotion, yeah, so they just didn't get the opportunity to get promoted in their workplace, that they had a more favorable opinion towards these opportunities than soldiers with high promotion opportunities. Well, basically the story here is that those guys who were in an environment where everybody else got promoted, they felt way worse about themselves than those guys who were in the same situation, but none of the people around them got promoted. That kind of makes sense. If you think about a world where everybody around your friends seems to be more successful, even though you live a good life, you start thinking, hang on, what am I doing wrong? While if none of your friends is successful and you're doing fairly well, you might say, oh, actually, I'm doing great. While objectively, you do exactly the same. So belonging to a group with a high promotion rate creates excessive hopes and increases the risk that they might be dashed. So now you see we have like the macro phenomena, promotion rate in this case, in that group, in that unit, and you have the individual sentiment. You see how that is affected by it, right? So if you would have a different promotion rate in that unit, individuals, exactly the same individuals, with exactly the same starting points in their careers, with exactly the same duties and jobs, they would feel very different about it. So the macro level creates the context for individual sentiments in this case. Now let me look at it in the other way around. When we have like individuals and they behave in a certain way, and how do we then come up to the macro level again? Yeah? Isn't it just that we just need to look at what everybody does, and then suddenly we kind of see what happens at the macro, at the society level at the end of the day. Well, actually, no, that's not how easy it is. And actually, we will have at least 2 or 3 lectures dedicated to just this phenomenon. And the example that is often used in this case is the one of segregation. By segregation, we mean separation of individuals into distinct parts of social life according to certain characteristics or attributes. And the classic example is residential segregation according to race. So what you see here is actually a map of New York. You see Staten Island down here, then you see Manhattan, you see Brooklyn and Queens. This is now data from 2000, it's a little older, but doesn't matter at the moment. Yeah? And what you see here now, color-coded, is like the percentage of certain ethnic groups living in these neighborhoods. And when you look at that, especially, when you look at sort of like Brooklyn down there and Queens or I don't know, or up north in the Bronx, you see like, God, this seems pretty segregated. Yeah? Whites seem to be living in a certain part of town. Manhattan is almost white. Staten Island is almost white. And then we have like blacks living in Brooklyn and in Queens, and up north in the Bronx, you have Hispanic majorities, like large degrees. So if you just look at that, as I said, we'll have like at least 2 lectures on that, you could conclude that people are incredibly racist, right? That there's something going on there. It's like a common sense theory that we could have. Unfortunately, there is some racism, but not everything is driven by that. In this case of segregation, people actually showed that the whole is actually not just the aggregation of individuals. Yeah? Very often there are dynamic processes that come into play here. And this is now a very simple example, and as I said, we'll have much more to talk about that. It's a very important topic. It's very important to kind of look at this in more detail. This is now what is known Schelling's model of segregation. You see a tiny little world here. Actually, there are 2,500 little individuals there. They have 2 colors. Some are orange, some are blue. And you see some are happy and some are unhappy. Yeah? And it's now a very simple rule that we can apply. These are randomly distributed individuals. There are some empty spots that we have where nobody lives. Let's just imagine this is now a city or this is a neighborhood or whatnot, right? It's a very abstract way of looking at things, but nevertheless very useful. And now we have a very simple rule. Very simple rule is, okay, whenever you are surrounded or when in your immediate neighborhood, less than 30% of the people are of the same color as you have, then you are unhappy, then you want to go somewhere else. So that also means people would be happy with being surrounded by 69, almost 70% individuals around them being different. So individuals actually would be happy to live in a mixed world. They just don't want to be in the minority. Right? And when we apply this simple rule, we can then play that out. We can see what would happen. And this is sort of like where then things like agent-based modeling or computer simulations come into play. They have very simple rules. That's the simple rule. But now you see what happens if that would be the rule that kind of governs individual behavior. And what happens, let me play that for you. Actually, what happens, some people get unhappy and they move elsewhere. And then what happens? Well, the environment changes and suddenly other people become unhappy who were happy before, but now they're unhappy. Now they move somewhere else. And you have these chain reactions that kind of follow from this very simple rule. And at the end of the day, what you observe here is a pretty segregated world, where most people are actually now surrounded by a majority of people who are similar to themselves, even though we just had the rule that they should move as soon as their neighborhood is less than 30% like themselves, they should move elsewhere. But we find at the end it's about 70% of individuals that are surrounded by, I don't know, of people with the same color. So this is now an example where individual behavior, very simple rules, leads to something at the macro level that is actually different from that. So 30% preference of people around oneself does not lead to 30% overall people being surrounded by different, similar people. Question?
I know that's displayed as two-dimensional.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be
In this case, probably it is. As you can imagine, there are so many nuances of this model. It's like wrapping it around, because how do you define the neighborhood of somebody at the top? Actually, in this case, it's true, it's kind of defined as a torus, is something there where the top one is actually the neighbor of the bottom one. But these are practicalities of these kind of models and how you want to play them out. But the big story here is the following: that strong segregation, which is a macro level pattern, can occur even when individuals have a preference to live in an integrated world. This is not to say that kind of all segregation that we observe stems from that. That's not what I'm saying. Right? This is like a very abstract phenomena, but it should make you aware of, hang on, these levels, I cannot just simply conclude from one level to the other. Right? And now, in this case, it is this level, this move upwards that kind of mess things around. So the behaviors of some individuals here change the world of others, which might then trigger other individuals to behave in a certain way, and so on. So we have individual preference to not be surrounded by others at the micro level, and we have racial segregation up there, but we need to be careful when we kind of jump from one level to the other. So at the end of the day, this is what you take out from this lecture. We have the James Coleman's boat. We have this macro level phenomena that we are interested in linking with each other, but we need to think about the individuals that are involved in that. And when we kind of look at this boat, I always say, this is sort of like my little personal battle, that if you want to look at these kind of things, if you want this boat to sail, we actually need to have social networks at the very core of it. Why? Because these are my people that kind of provide the social context for me. And then you can think this even further. Some people call this James Coleman's fleet. Of course, you think, okay, one individual changes the social context, which then kind of is seen by an individual, by another individual in a different way, and so on. So you have a lot of chain of these little boats next to each other. Okay, so on Tuesday there's no lecture. On Thursday you get a guest lecture, and you have a reading for the week afterwards. Yeah. So you will see me again on the 2nd of October.
Thank you.